You are listening to Accents, a radio show for literature, art, and culture. I'm your host, Katerina Stoikova, and my guest today is Stuart Horodner. Hi, Stuart, how are you?
Hi, Katerina. I'm great.
Welcome to the show again.
Pleasure to be back.
Yeah, in a very, very different way and under different circumstances. Stuart Horodner serves as the director of the UK Arts Museum. His writing has appeared in periodicals including Art Issues, Art Lies, Art on Paper, Bomb, Dazed and Confused, Sculpture and Surface. Horodner's book, The Art Life on Creativity and Career, was published in 2012 and addresses the philosophical and practical issues that affect art making at the marketplace. Well, I'm going to interview you as the director of the UK Museum, but I also want to interview as the writer that you are. My first question, and one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you right now, is the new exhibit that opened at the museum earlier this month.
Sure. The exhibit is called This is America, and it attempts to look at the country at this particular moment from a variety of different points of view, from issues of history and race, protest, identity, landscape. I mean, a variety of things that make up the country and its ongoing attempt at excellence. You know, we speak of American exceptionalism. It's not always an excellent place, but the exhibit tries to wrestle with some of those conflicts that are always ongoing.
And what are, I guess, maybe the opening hours of the museum or the new procedures that people can or should follow to go visit?
Sure. Well, trying to be responsible in the COVID era, we have an appointment schedule. People can get on our website, can sign up for an appointment by the hour. We have a limit of 20 visitors per hour, which feels like people can socially distance and also have a lot of space in the museum to move around freely. And the museum's open from Tuesday to Friday from 10 to 5, and on Saturday from 12 to 5.
Can you talk to us to the process of selecting work or inviting participants, basically the curating of this exhibit?
Sure. I should also mention there's another exhibit that's coincides with This is America, which is a small solo exhibit by Gene Silverthorne, a New York sculptor. But the question you're asking is for me, the most fascinating part of doing curatorial work, which is the space between idea and installation. In this case, the idea of the exhibit was to coincide with the presidential election. So that means the exhibit was at least a year in the planning. And in that time frame, the pandemic appeared. And so I made some accommodations to the selection of work, included more work about race and protest, some work about health and safety and illness. Most of the work is from our collection. That was both because we have an abundance of riches in our collection, but also from a budget standpoint, because the ease of using material that the university already owns was obviously quite direct and inexpensive. But I did invite a group of artists from New York, from Atlanta, borrowing work from galleries, studios, collections, to broaden the scope of what was in the exhibit. And I have to say, the combination of work that we have in our collection with these strategic loans has made a really rich exhibit.
What has been the reception so far? What are the reactions of people who visit the exhibit?
Well, they're really, I mean, I should say the fun part of having this exhibit open in the first place is just the joy of the museum being open and people coming back after so many months of being closed and, you know, cooped up at home. So I do think it's creating a very attentive visitor. People are happy to not just be looking at things on their screen. Artworks on a screen might be informative, but they're certainly not as robust an experience as an actual visit. And people have been very thoughtful responses. The people seem to look at the exhibit slowly. There's quite a lot to look at, as you know. Juxtapositions of things require not only looking at single works, but seeing them in proximity and alignment with other works. There's a rather, to my mind, very, what's the right word? Unfinished quality to the way I installed the exhibit, which includes painting certain walls in a rather fast and not quite perfect way. That was very conscious to try to install these works and situate them on colors that are not particularly gentle. All the paint I used was from previous exhibits, so it's all remnant color, not exactly chosen exactly for this, but chosen from what we had. And so there's a rather improvisational and unfinished quality to the backdrop, which I think is very appropriate to the unfinished democratic project of the country. And this not quite rightness feels exactly right to me to try to talk about America at this time.
But there were some, I guess, intentional and coincidental choices of proximity and how certain works communicate with one another or strengthen each other. Can you speak about that process of laying out an exhibit? To me, that is pretty fascinating. It resembles the process of putting a book together.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think, well, I mean, I hope that we'll talk a little bit about that, you know, confluence of things, but very much once I had a checklist to the exhibit, I knew the works that were going to be included. And over now 6 years of working in the museum, I'm very comfortable knowing it's the space of it, the volume of the rooms, what works, I mean, I think particularly well on certain walls. As you know, the museum is quite large in terms of an atrium, a kind of big volume. And there are some unbelievably large works in the exhibit, you know, things in the realm of 9 to 13 feet. And so those immediately established a situation of they can only go on certain walls. And then I had quite a lot of the work arranged on drawings and notes as to where things would go. But then when you get the artworks in the gallery, for me, there's always a moment where you realize this isn't going to work. This combination maybe is a little too direct. I'll give you an example. There's a Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington from the late 1700s. And there's a video, which is really an animation, a hand-drawn animation, a drawing which is unraveled by an artist named Michael Wong from San Francisco. And it's a drawing of George Floyd. And from the beginning, I knew that this painting, this oil painting, and this video, George Washington, George Floyd, needed to be next to each other to kind of tell a story of America from the founding father to this person whose death has, you know, ignited protests all over the world. And I said to someone recently that I thought maybe the country could be synopsized in the space between George Washington and George Floyd. And even looking at, you know, who are these men? How do we understand them? What might be the relationship? Certainly the founding fathers who owned slaves is part of one of the most challenging aspects of reconciling contradictions. They were brilliant in articulating a vision of how the democracy was going to work and what its goals were. And at the same time, that democracy for hundreds of years has failed African Americans in many ways. And so that was something I knew was going to happen. And when I put the two works together, it really spoke to me in a way that I had hoped. Now, a different pairing I had no intention of putting together, which was a 1950 photograph by Elliot Erwitt of a Black man drinking from the colored water fountain in a photograph that shows a white water fountain and a colored water fountain. And this man is drinking his water in the segregated South. That photograph was placed next to a Sheldon Tapley pastel of a Midwestern alley between some houses, which is a beautiful pastel drawing of a rather benign landscape, you know, the sort of back road between homes, the sort of way in which people might enter their home from a back porch or a back door. But oddly enough, the drawing is bisected in a similar way to the photograph, which is a formal relationship that I didn't really think about until they happened to be sitting next to each other. But more importantly, I was thinking about putting that drawing in a whole section on landscape, which it is, but the pairing with the photograph made a charge that was very unexpected and almost begged the viewer to ask, who's living in this home? What is the impact of segregation on people who live in this Midwestern area being depicted? And so no exhibit really would be the likely, I mean, a typical exhibit would not pair these two works. They exist in different media, they exist in different time frames. The traditions they speak of are totally different, but somehow the taking of this very seemingly simple, seemingly casual American vernacular landscape of architecture and putting it next to this charged photograph about race set up a real tension that's quite exciting. And there are some other, you know, moments like that in the exhibit that in many cases were not exactly planned.
You mentioned earlier that this quote, maybe, this won't work together because they're too direct. What is too direct?
Sometimes it just seems maybe that the combination of works feels too obvious, or it feels maybe too focused on, I want you to see this thing and I insist on, you know, shaping your vision, which of course an exhibit is that in itself. It may be a story, although I would prefer to maybe talk about exhibits as poems rather than stories. And we can talk about how or why that might work. But I guess for me, it's a sort of obviousness that one tries to avoid, because you still want the works to be engaging and mysterious, which, you know, all artwork is, I think all good artwork has multiple levels in which it operates. And with an exhibit like this, that's very multi-voiced and is hung in a very dense way, there's quite a lot to sort out as a viewer. And I wanted to insist on that level of complexity so that you felt like you were constantly having to adjust your thoughts, your feelings, as one thing maybe operated on another, and all of them operated on you.
So yes, how are paintings in an exhibition like poems in a book? One of the things that I loved about the exhibit was that the leaps that I had to make on my own, the connections that I had to make on my own, on this section or on this wall, and to allow the artwork and the combinations of art on the walls and their placement to do their work on me, the same way that I also try to supply my understanding and my attitude. So yes, it was as if I was strolling through a book of poetry.
I know that I've said to you on other occasions that poetry has had an enormous effect on how I think about artworks and exhibits. And there's something about the space of being in a gallery and thinking about the space of the gallery, maybe in the way that one can think about the page. And when one's reading, a narrative, a story, the page is not operating in that way. The continued drive of the narrative is keeping you moving as you read lines, as you continue with sentences, as those sentences move into paragraphs, and you become driven by the ongoing curiosity of what's happening to the characters and a narrative that's being constructed for you by the writer. I guess in many ways, I feel an exhibit in space feels more like lines on a page of poetry, which can be continuous and narrative, but also can be fragmentary and can have their own disconnection as well as connection. So how words appear, where lines break and move you back, how juxtaposition works, how stanzas work, how, the structure of poems, whether they're being very rigorous or loose, seems to give the words an ability to be themselves and something else in a way that I feel like artworks do that. I feel like poetry has just influenced so much of my thinking about the way in which objects function and the way in which proximity and difference and space, time, moving towards something, getting closer to see it, staying there for a minute, moving on to another thing. That just feels very much, in my mind, the way poems work. Maybe poems and exhibits, to my thinking, are more like essences of things that I think in presentness in a way that's different than a story. Poems insist on presentness in a way that that artworks do. At least I think so. Do you think so?
Well, how could it be different? I cannot imagine seeing a painting or any kind of artwork or reading any kind of poem without bringing 100% of my presence in it. That's why it is so difficult to read 5 hours of poetry today, because being constantly present, that tires you out if you don't have that kind of, if you don't have serious training in the art of reading poems or the art of looking at artwork and really interacting with it. Well, I have a question now, which is how has the pandemic affected your own creativity and your own writing?
Yeah, well, this was obviously the pandemic, shook everybody out of whatever their normal rhythm was. And me working from home for several months gave me time to think about things differently. And I obviously was thinking about many of the things that were being driven by this new situation. Will the market be running out of bread? Who will I see? Will I see anyone? Will I be safe? What do I need to do to maintain my safety and my sanity? You know, and so I found myself trying to express maybe more than normal, or in a new medium, which is writing more consistently. Writing, my writing, as you know, is often for a purpose that's work related. An essay for a brochure, vinyl text on the wall that may accompany an exhibit, um, grant writing. I mean, all of the things that are part of the administrative curatorial work that I and my colleagues at the museum do, letters of recommendation for artists, things like this. And even though I've kind of dabbled in writing poetry and consider myself interested in being a poet and having many poet friends whose works really enrich me, I don't think I ever really bit on that idea that I would write poetry consistently and with more intensity and more, if those other forms of writing I was just mentioning are in a sense for other people, because they're always imagining the reader and they have a particular structure. I felt like it was an opportunity in COVID to write for myself.
So you wrote poems.
So I wrote poems, I constructed poems. How I write poems is a combination of sort of collage and note-taking and impressions of things that accumulate into, as you say, the presence to now sit and finish the poem. So if you'd like, I could read you a poem that was written early in the sort of pandemic as an example.
Yes.
Let me grab one here. Most of these are, most of the poems, I should say, that I write are relatively short. I'm going to grab some water. I guess I'm drinking it, not grabbing it. But so this is a poem called Now, which, written a few months ago, was obviously about the beginnings of this moment in COVID. Now, a bag of chips off the shelf may become symptoms. The truth is, your stay was always chess on a raft. Take care only thickens.
That is lovely.
Now, I should say that
very thought-provoking.
I didn't sit down. I mean, you know this because we've spoken about this. People may be familiar with, you know, the sort of game, the magnetic game, found poetry, a sort of existing level or a grouping of words that one puts together in a very accumulative way. And I guess might be helpful to sort of show, you know, this, which is a kind of collection of things that I keep that impress me or inspire me, quotes, photographs. But during COVID, for the first time, I started to construct poems in these little books. And so all the language was taken from magazines that I read, the New York Times, newspapers, the New Yorker, art magazines, various things that I would, after reading articles, I would sort of circle words or groupings of words that made sense to me. And I've been doing that form of gathering writing. You know, it may be a stretch to call it curating, you know, but in a way it's a found body of language in the way that.
Well, I don't think it's a stretch to call it curating. You're curating the words that offered themselves to you and your attention for a particular reason.
So that notion of being attracted to certain words or circling them or cutting them out and kind of creating a field from which to select words, to find something like symptoms, to find the word raft, to not sit down and say, I'm writing a poem about COVID now, but to just feel my way through sentences, fragments that started to form. And in the conclusion of those little sequences, in a way, I start to reveal to myself how I feel about things, not always having that feeling be so certain at the beginning. And I guess part of the joy for me of working in this kind of accumulated way is that I recognize moments of myself in the world, or I recognize my feelings in the process of constructing these short poems, in some cases, some longer poems. But I really started doing this seriously in that first week or two of COVID, and I've continued ever since. And it's probably been the most sustained period of time of writing poems, constructing poems that I've ever had. And I've started, writing occasionally poems, in my early 20s, which is now quite a long time ago. So it feels very fertile, this period of feeling, thinking, listening, looking. And I think being home gave me a tremendous amount of time to dive in a way that I hadn't before.
So would you say, how many poems would you say that you have now?
Oh, I don't know, maybe somewhere like 50 or 60 poems. I mean, some of them I'm not sure if they're finished, but some feel robust enough to call finished poems.
So maybe you're close to having a manuscript, your first poetry collection.
It feels like a body of writing.
Yeah.
And I have been spending some time kind of rewriting and relooking and sort of thinking about what does this grouping look like as a collection. And that certainly has been the first time in my poetry writing career where I ever felt like I was doing it intensely enough and the results felt of a sort that might make some sense in a book.
So would you read us several more poems, please?
Sure. Let's see. All right. Actually, let me read let's read a poem that seems related to the other discussions about art and museums or exhibits. So this is a poem called The Artist. And as you said at the beginning, I've written, a book of advice about creative work for artists. But I don't think I've ever written a poem. I know I've never written a poem that's called The Artist until this moment a few months ago. It's called The Artist. Just show up seeking the wrong idea about approval.
Brilliant, brilliant. Before you read some more,
Sure.
I guess I want to ask you about the art life on creativity and career and all the wonderful advice that's in that book. Can you think of several pieces of advice that apply to you and your own writing right now?
That's a great question. Yeah, it is. Well, it is something when you realize that if you're in the position of dispensing advice, it's probably a good idea to take your own. Although there is a phrase, and I don't remember when I heard it, I'm sure I heard it in my youth, which is a sort of old saying, which is that people teach best the thing that they most need to learn. So sometimes you can be excellent at giving advice, even if you don't take the advice yourself. I guess
different skills involved, right?
Exactly. I guess the thing that comes out of maybe not mentioning a specific piece of advice, but I think the accumulated advice that's in the book is really about the work does not make itself. You have to be present, as we were speaking, you have to be present, you have to be fearless, you have to be open, you have to, I mean, you know, in a sense, what I said in that poem, just show up seeking the wrong idea about approval. And I, as a young artist, thought quite a lot about approval and wanting people to like what I made and being very externally driven about others and their opinions. And a painting teacher of mine many years ago, a man named Jake Berteau at the Cooper Union where I studied, and I don't remember if I put him in the book, I don't think so, but he came to my studio to look at my work, and he asked me maybe the most profound question that anyone had ever asked me, and since the most important question. He said, after looking at these works, he said, I know you're very serious and you want to be a good painter, but are you having any fun? And I almost didn't know how to answer. I mean, I said, well, I'm trying to. He said, I mean, have you felt engaged in the making of these works? Do you feel like you're learning through the making? Do you feel like the making of this painting is taking you somewhere? Forget, you really want me to like it. I know you want the other students to like it. You probably would like your grandmother to like it. All of those things are outside of you. You have to really first be your own first audience and your own first, in a sense, you're collaborating with yourself. This work is coming out of you. And I guess for me, this whole new burst of writing has been really fun. It sometimes tries to take on a dark moment, but for the first time in my, creative life, I would say, I'm having the kind of fun in trying to write poems that I have in making exhibits. The same sense of surprise, the same sense of feeling like I'm finding a little voice that feels true to me. And that feels really great. So does
I
that
think
answer your question?
absolutely. And I do think that dark poems can be fun too. It's just peeking into the darkness that is very satisfying. Can you read us several more?
Sure. Um, so I wrote a series of, I think it's 13 poems that came because I started I wrote the first one and then wrote a series after that are very structured in the same way. And if I read two of them, you'll certainly understand what I mean. And the title of these poems is And Another Thing. And Another Thing. Take me to your cabin. We can study Stephen King in there. Marry me, I'm funny, and dinner is on the table. You may want to let the moment happen and get flowers after. I always say a dictionary is never far away, and sometimes you have to break the landscape to go forward. So that was the first And Another Thing poem. And then several followed. This is And Another Thing, number 5. Take me home. It is Juneteenth and we're celebrating. Marry me. I'm tender and live in my head between the sheets. You may want to search for more plywood. I always say, nobody knows John Cage enough. And then Another Thing, 7. Take me to marches and protests. My fists want a second opinion. Marry me, I'm old and it's late. I only cry every other minute. You may want to take the bus and give blood. I always say we must have sex as sunlight cuts through the leaves. And writing poems that were titled And Another Thing had this kind of engine of just, well, do another one and do another one. And all of them would start with, take me, the next phrase, marry me, you may want to, I always say. And those were the continuing starts.
You invented a form, and you wrote in form.
Well, I mean, certainly the range of, the range of poetry that I've read in my life certainly has, this sort of rhythmic. I mean, if you read Allen Ginsberg or any number of writers where repetition drives the engine of the poem, and I feel like those. I'm reading more than I ever have. I'm reading with a different sense of not only joy, but I'm being informed by what I'm reading differently because I'm writing.
Well, I know that you're a reader of poetry, or devoted reader of poetry for decades. For decades, who are some of your heroes? Some of the people you've learned from?
Well, what's interesting is that I guess I started reading poetry in my late teens, and I came across a lot of. I was reading then, I should say, people like Richard Brautigan, Allen Ginsberg, Maya Angelou, Robert Frost. I mean, some other, sort of more canonical poets as well. And then I got very interested in poets in New York City, where, of course, I was living for much of my early life, who were also art critics. I didn't necessarily know about either their poetry before I became aware of their art writing, but in some cases, some of the most interesting poets of, to my mind, the 1950s and 60s, into today, were people like Frank O'Hara and James Schuyler, Kenneth Koch, John Ashbery. So I was reading a lot of, what's called New York School poetry, and many of the younger poets who were influenced by those people, David Lehman, Eileen Miles, Wayne Kustenbaum, John Yao. Many of these people do double duty as amazing art critics. And so that made an interesting impression on me, since they were so good at, using language to describe artworks that they were reviewing, but also in my life as a gallery owner in New York in the early 1990s, I got to meet a lot of these writers and poets, and many of them became friends of mine. And that has also, in a way, come back to inspire me in a different way. And as you know, over the last few years, I've invited some of these writers to come to UK and give readings, but also to talk about art and its relationship to their writing. So Eileen Miles has come, Wayne Kustenbaum has come, John Yao has been here. And can I read a little poem by Eileen Miles, just as an
Absolutely, yes.
example? So again, in a very, and you do this quite well in very good company, is write unbelievably powerful short poems. But Eileen Miles, in a recent book called Evolution, has a poem that I adore called The Baby. The baby says to the old man, "Let's have a cup of coffee." The old man says, "Now you're talking."
Love it.
And of course, that double read on, now you're talking as this is a good idea to go have coffee, but
Right.
also the baby now starting to have language. So, short poems sometimes for me are unbelievably powerful and potent, like taking a little pill and having this like revelation happen. And I guess I should say that very early in my reading life, I became fascinated with haiku, and have read a lot of haiku, by Japanese masters as well as American writers and others using that form. And those the ideas of what the structure of what happens in haiku, the compression of feeling, the sense of place, what's called often that aha moment of revelation, has really interested me. And I guess I've always written in a rather tight, short word count, hopefully for maximum emotion or maximum clarity about whatever I'm writing about. But short things have always, impressed me quite a lot. And something that would be fun to say is that, now many years ago in 2000, I sort of invented something with a friend that in a conversation called haiku criticism, which was this idea that since so many poets were art critics, could we invite a group of writers to write reviews of exhibits in New York City or elsewhere at that time using only 17 syllables? And so the idea would be similar to a haiku that might have a sort of establishing line or a seasonal line, like it's June and
Right.
right. And maybe the second line of the haiku criticism would be the description of an artwork. And then the final line would be the rendering of an opinion about it. And so Art Issues, which is a journal now defunct from the West Coast, published a series of these short reviews in haiku format by myself, my friend David Humphrey, who's a painter and writer, and many people like Eileen Miles and Wayne Kustenbaum and Mira Shore and artists and writers, who all took a stab at this. And I think it's a really good exercise because the form is very
Yes.
generative and interesting when you try to write about an exhibit. It'd be so fascinating for someone to try to write a review of our current exhibits in 17 syllables, for example.
Yeah. While you were speaking, I was thinking, can I come up with 17 syllables right now about This is America? And I didn't want to embarrass myself, so I didn't. I will give it some thought though, and maybe some of the listeners of Accents will go to see the exhibit. It will be on until February, right?
Yes, till February 13th.
And then they can write a haiku review about it and send it to Stuart.
That would be wonderful. So, for example, if you like, I found a haiku a series of haiku that I wrote in some cases years ago, and some which I wrote recently. But I wrote one recently, which
read us a few. Read us more than one.
Okay. So here are a few haiku. June rain bouncing on my $7 haircut. No sign of the bus. Abandoned city painted by Edward Hopper. Welcome, aliens. Bending over to tie your shoelaces, the same in any city. And so, for example, that haiku about tying your shoelaces happened in a very obvious way of leaning over to tie my shoelaces and realizing that at that moment, you are only focusing on that action and where you are entirely disappears. And so it just came to me that that moment obliterates all place all the time. And that there was maybe something true about that moment. The June rain one, I remember having just gotten a haircut similar to this one, like a very $7, finished in 3 minutes haircut in Hoboken, New Jersey, 20 some odd years ago. And it's starting to rain very lightly. And the rain just felt like it was, bouncing on my very newly aware of, like, the sense of my hair gone, and in a sense, this rain popping on my skull, and waiting for the bus. And in that kind of classic haiku moment, it immediately established, it's June, I'm in a place, something is happening, but you're not exactly expecting that, no sign of the bus line. And so it has that truth, this is what was happening, but also has that moment of, when haiku is often compared to film language, it's, that last line is often understood like a jump cut in film, where something is happening in a certain way, but then you're kind of immediately taken to someplace else, or come in really close for a detail after an establishing shot and then a mid shot. It's like if we were doing this right now, you and I are in mid shot, but if all of a sudden I was focused on your cheek in the jump cut, it was like, ooh, now we're looking at this little detail. And so I love haiku, and so it's fun writing them. It's fun reading them. It's also really interesting for me now. I don't think I ever realized how helpful in getting emotion out, or even understanding emotion that's in me, how helpful writing these poems have been. I mean, people who are friends of mine know that in the last 4 years, for both my parents passed away, and both of them passed away after struggling with very harsh decline through dementia, which obviously took a toll on their sense of being, but also took a toll on myself and my brother, and caretaking for them. And there were times where, because they were not aware of many things, what would come out of their mouths to answers to simple questions would get rather surreal, or would be just mind-blowingly sad because of the immediacy of answering something, realizing what they knew or didn't know anymore, including not knowing, my brother or myself at a certain point. And so, how do you write about that? And I had no real interest in writing about that exactly at the time. But a few months ago, I wrote this very short little poem called My Mother, which is the title, My Mother, and then it moves into the poem. My mother hit the nail on the peanut butter. It was hard to criticize. And that's a poem really, for me, about, that's absurd on the one hand, takes that phrase, hitting the nail on the head, but what does it mean to hit the nail on the peanut butter? That has some of the weirdness and surprise maybe about that dementia state. But then, it was hard to criticize was a lesson that we were learning constantly, which was, how do you accept someone who is slipping away from you as this is what they're capable of? And maybe they're aware of what's lost, but in that moment with you, you're constantly being, brought to the attention of, this isn't the person who they used to be. And you have to be, it seemed very important to not be frustrated, fight against depression and anger that the person couldn't do more, feeling sad at your own circumstance that you had to deal with all of this, even though you were dutifully trying to. It was exhausting at various times. And I don't know that poem gets at the enormity of those feelings, but it gets at it in a little way. And so those feelings are all in here somewhere. And this act of writing obviously gets them out in a form.
And there will be other poems, and there will be more writing, because what I have found out is that sometimes nothing but poetry will do, and only when we're ready, because sometimes it takes 4 years to write a poem about your parents or the decline.
Mhm.
Would you like to share several more poems with us?
Oh, sure. There are a couple here. Well, here, this is an example of a poem that's a little different than maybe what I've read already, which is people may be familiar with the photograph of President Trump, and in some cases his daughter Ivanka, um, holding up cans of Goya products after the president of the Goya food company said some positive things about the president on television. And, you know, the Goya display of products were on the Resolute desk in the White House. And I saw a photograph that I cut out and pasted into my journal of Ivanka holding this can of beans. And it struck me as, you know, I have a lot of feelings about that. And, you know, I started a poem, and some words I found made sense, but the beans became the word that seemed to be really important. And so this is a poem from a very, you know, pop culture moment in the last year called Confident Girl with Beans, after Ivanka. All day long, she told me our bodies are not our own. To be an excellent person in this world, you must emphasize beans for the camera. Beauty beans, fame beans, beans in every sentence, daughter beans to better butter father with.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stuart. And I have one last question, and this is, do you know what the next exhibit will be at the museum?
Yes, if I don't know, who should know? Uh,
Okay.
the next exhibit, well, the next exhibit that will be in the main gallery after, well, we have several, let me say it this way. We have several exhibits that are opening in the next few weeks, which are upstairs on the second floor of the museum in the area dedicated to our permanent collection. One of them is an exhibit featuring many works from the collection which have cats in them. The title of that exhibit is How About Them Cats, which is rather a wink at our sports team, but has some amazing paintings and drawings of cats, everything from domestic cats to wild cats. And that will open a small exhibit pairing the work of Patrick Smith, who's a painter here in Lexington, with prints by, wow, I just lost it. This is why you have booklets around. It's very, see, you asked me, I said it very confidently, who would know, and then I lost Victor Hammer. So Patrick Smith, a pairing of Patrick's paintings with prints by Victor Hammer, who lived in Lexington, was an artist, and he and his wife Carolyn started the King Library Press at UK. Very well-known painter in another period of Lexington's art culture. And so those are two exhibits that are opening rather quickly in the next couple of weeks, really, into early November. So those are two of the things that are coming up.
Thank you so much, Stuart. I appreciate you coming on Accents to talk about the exhibit, to read us your poems, and to talk about creativity. Good luck with your writing, and good luck with your work at the museum, and may you be safe and happy.
Thank you, Katerina. It's great to have this time to talk about these things and share some of this writing with you. It really is, it's meaningful to me, and I thank you.